folks who want to get an outline to come in? Hey.
My name is Leo.
Leo. You just joined a moment ago.
Yep.
Good. What you want, let me just get the chapter. So, of the syllabus.
Thank you.
And then the other lecture outlines, the ones we're doing just Friday, are on the website.
On Blackboard?
Correct. And you can also, so you can catch up immediately then. If you want to go over the day around the syllabus, there's a link right on the website. And then especially the lecture on Friday. And
that might take a while for my Blackboard to get re-caught up with the schedule change, but I'll definitely.
Okay, hopefully, actually, let me just make a note of that. I can do that immediately, in fact.
Okay.
You're right, I should have done that earlier this morning, I forgot about that. It's so black. I will add you to Blackboard. I also sent you an email. Unfortunately, the only presentation group to add you to was the first one.
Okay.
You have more than enough time to do it, but I sent an email to everyone in the group, so they should be including you in any future planning and group meetings. All right? Immediately upon getting out of class, I'll make sure that you have access to the Blackboard site of the class, and then we'll go from there. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Good. Good to have you.
Thank you. Good.
Okay, folks, as you come in, please remember, I usually leave outlines right there in the corner, so if you don't have an outline, please pick one up. Yeah, that's right.
Oh my gosh. So and we're right out there. And you made it. Oh my god.
Give me a little brief.
Hey. Crazy school. Yeah, it's bad. Like my right hip is never done that.
Folks, is anyone here who's here for the first time? There's nothing. Oh, great. Anyone else? No. What's your name, sir?
Brian Castro.
Brian Castro. Okay, good. So you're out of foreign.
Yeah. No.
Good. Excellent. All right.
I like doing it
Want to get an outline?
At the Children's Museum, they have a really cool picture.
And then you have to.
Oh,
That's-
cool.
Yeah, we want to for everything else in the world.
Oh, you're talking about this.
It's expensive, so, but it wasn't nice.
When I was 10.
Yeah.
If folks who want to get an outline, come in. Now, usually in the future, so I'll just leave the outlines right there in the corner, so then you'll know to pick them up. If you come in late, I don't care. I'll just make sure we pick them up. Are there any questions before we get underway? Just to do, again, all of you will realize that the first presentation is coming up on Friday, which is really more than enough time to prepare, though. Make sure you know what presentation group you're in, though. For all of you, it's a good thing to know. And again, I know if you ever talk to people who took this course in the past, you'll realize I normally want people to physically come in person for presentations. This semester, of course, everything's a little crazy. If, of course, you're ill, I do not want you to come for a presentation. If you want to record things in advance and then play them for people who work here, that's fine. I have no objection to that. All right, so if you want to do electronic, sort of electronically present, that is absolutely fine in this semester. The preference is still to come in person, if you can absolutely swing it. If not, please just let me know. All right, I have no objection to that, because I do not want anyone coming if you are feeling sick. Today, what we're going to be talking about is ancient Egypt. I always usually bring these with me to talk about ancient Egypt. If you do not know what this is, I promise you by the end of this lecture, I will actually be able to tell you what these things are. And if you want to get to the fact that you come and touch them, I usually pass them around, but they're telling me not to pass anything around these days. So if you individually want to come see it afterwards, feel free. Yeah, go ahead. Please.
John?
So, yeah, Josh, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Thank you.
All right. Now, I had mentioned to you in our previous session, especially when it comes to the ancient world, and when it comes to the development of civilization, one of the things that was absolutely essential is water. And today, especially in ancient Egypt, we're going to discuss the civilization for which to understand its source of water is to understand a great deal about how it ran. We'll get more into that in a moment. It is fair to say that perhaps even more so than many other ancient civilizations, we know a great deal about the water source for ancient Egypt. And although this is not helping me with this particular slide, what you will see here is a slide of the country of Egypt. And you'll see going down the middle of it, kind of like a backbone, is its great water source. And what this is the river Nile. And many historians have described ancient Egypt as being, in essence, an oasis. So you've heard the term oasis, again, this sort of an area in the course of the desert in which you can actually get water. But Egypt is a very particular kind of oasis. Not a teeny little spot for refreshing, but an entire civilization, in essence, that is, has an oasis right at the center, surrounded by vast amounts of desert. And that water, the Nile, is useful in many different ways we'll discuss. And in particular, it is very useful in that in the ancient world, everyone knew exactly when the Nile would flood. Flooding was not a calamitous event. Flooding was an annual event that could easily be predicted, and they could use that flooding because they knew when it would flood. They could use the water and the land that eventually would be exposed once the flood waters receded, then to plant underneath it. I can't show you flood from the ancient world. I can show you, however, this is actually a modern day flood that happened before a dam was put in modern Egypt. It shows that flooding occurred well into the modern period as well. we think that the real benefit then of having the Nile then is it allowed for this rich kind of agriculture used with exactly the kind of soil that had previously been underwater during the time of the flood. And then they could actually use this to be able then to plant and harvest things like vegetables, barley, and animals that would populate the areas that are on either sides of the banks. So for instance, again, this is certain kinds of birds, fish that would be around the swamp, in some cases, other kinds of game as well. All of these things. Really, in some sense, people sometimes refer to ancient Egypt as really being the gift of the Nile, because this civilization would have been entirely uninhabitable had it not been for this, this remarkable water source that runs right down its middle. And to give you just some sense of how pivotal the Nile was to the ancient Egyptians' conception of their country, if you look here, they actually have this accurately on this map, that this portion of ancient Egypt is Upper Egypt, and this portion here is Lower Egypt. And initially you may think that this map maker was geographically challenged and didn't know north from south. But in fact, this is perfectly accurate based upon how ancient Egyptians saw the world. The reason for these markers, upper to lower, is because this is the direction the Nile flows. In fact, it goes, by our terms, it goes north and eventually enters into the Mediterranean. I realize this map is terrible. You can't see its top here. This is the Mediterranean Sea. And many of you also will see here at the top one of the areas that it was most fruitful, the most amount of agriculture could be produced in all of ancient Egypt. This is this region up here that we know as the Nile Delta. And you'll see, of course, the reason why we call it a delta. I realize this looks just like a triangle. That was the point. The fourth letter in the Greek alphabet looks exactly like a triangle. That is the letter delta. And so when ancient Greeks saw this, and they saw the shape of it, they said, it looks exactly like a delta. And so they began to refer to it as the delta, the Nile Delta. And to this day, they still refer to this area as the delta. Because we don't have fraternity and sorority, so I had to explain what letter this was. You get the idea. And this actually, in fact, you can see, I also like the fact in this map, you'll see this area, the delta, is done in green, because in fact, this was actually the most agriculturally rich area of all of ancient Egypt. Frustratingly for archaeologists, it's also one of the most poorly known areas of ancient Egypt, because in fact, it was so waterlogged in that area, it's actually destroyed a lot of the structures that used to be there. So we don't know about it as much as we know about some of these areas where fewer people live further down south you go. All right. So the first thing to note about ancient Egypt is its basic geographical location. Here's a nice, some foods that ancient Egyptians could set their table with based upon their work on the Nile. What do we know then about its political situation? Especially when it comes to ancient Egypt. The further back we go, the less we know, in fact, about its history. And one of the very frustrating things about the history of this civilization is that we start getting more documents, we start getting more sources when Egypt for the first time becomes a united kingdom. We know that before some of our earlier sources, previously those two sections, the desert-like region in the south, Upper Egypt, and Lower Egypt, had once actually been independent kingdoms. The great sort of like big bang at the beginning of ancient Egyptian history is finally when one king from the south came, conquered the north, fused the two together, and made one kingdom of the two areas, so forming an actual kingdom. It was a kingdom that in one way or another would last for centuries. Now, one of the interesting things about this sort of this fusion of a new kingdom is that we do not actually have very good written sources for it. What we have is a fantastic archaeological find. This is something that is known as the Narmer palette. You don't really actually have to know that name. It would look like to you like a very thin shield. And what's most exciting to us is that the carving that we've discovered on it. This fellow here, you can see, is one of the earliest pharaohs. We'll talk more about this, but basically just a king that we can identify. We know that because you can see here, the falcon was one of the birds that was always attached to the pharaoh, his blessing in some way here. And we can see, by the way, from the early stages, what one of the basis of power for the pharaoh was. You notice he has a captive here, and he's just about to bash his skull out. So in fact, it was violence was really at the heart. Now, okay, you may wonder what this has to do with what we were just talking about. If you look closely on the other side of the same thing, you'll see, first of all, people being led off to execution, because again, there's a lot of violence involved in this process. But you'll also see this. This sort of weird, unnatural animal, or two animals, you can say. And you notice what's happening here. Their two necks are intertwining to form one. And the way that most historians have tended to read this is that this is a symbol of the new state, of the new Egyptian state. Two parts that were previously disconnected coming together as one. But we only really have this through this very symbolic fashion. This is, in fact, one of our earliest sources from ancient Egypt. This wonderful source. Yeah, please.
So when, like, people find these, like, in the dirt or whatever, how do they know what everything means?
They did it. In fact, we had this for a long time. And at first, we didn't actually know what it was for quite some time before we actually realized that this is one of the most important finds we ever had from ancient Egypt. So the simple reason is that, especially as archaeology used to be done, people did it as fast as humanly possible. Dig it up, get it out of the ground. And very often we'd have these things, these statues lying around that we didn't know what they meant. And it took actually years and years to sort of put them in some sort of context. So we didn't know immediately what this meant. It's a simple answer. Please.
So is this shield like, it goes over your head and it covers the front and back, or is it just one and it has like a front and back?
It's one and it has a front and back. And in fact, I use the term shield, it's a bad term. We don't think this ever had any practical usage. This was entirely something to just demonstrate this new fusion. It was not ever actually used in a battle or anything like that.
But then like, what would they do with it? Because like you can't see the other side, like if you hang it up or something.
It's a good question. We don't know how it was displayed in the ancient world. Is the very frustrating thing about this. It's possible that they found some way to sort of like put it in wood or something that you could see both sides or something like that. But the simple answer is I don't know, and no one does either. Once ancient Egypt becomes a united monarchy, there's one king over the entire thing. All of a sudden now you have an outpouring of written material that previously you did not have. Because when you have a kingship, you have people who work for you, as we'll discuss in a moment. And you have all sorts of sources that they produce. Monarchy produces paperwork. Now, one of the great problems, though, is that those people who do study ancient Egypt have to deal with around 3,000 years worth of history. And you can imagine this is a little bit frustrating. There's more than one ways that those who study ancient Egypt have chosen to divide up this period and make it into bite-sized chunks. One way is to to divide it up into what are referred to as dynasties, ruling houses, families who are in charge. The big problem with this is that there were 31 different dynasties of kings, which also is way too many for our uses. The simple way to divide ancient Egyptian history, in fact, the fallback way that many will use, is to use what are referred to as kingdoms. Three very important periods in ancient Egyptian history, known as the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. Periods of time where ancient Egypt found its greatest strength The monarchy was strong and united. The economy was relatively strong, and we get a lot of our written sources. We've got a lot of our physical sources as well, monuments and things we'll speak about in a moment. This chart is a little bit more complicated than it needs to be, but you'll see here those three kingdoms, kind of the steps here, which the New Kingdom normally is associated with the height of ancient Egyptian wealth and influence. And we'll have in between the Old and Middle, and Middle and New, and after that we have referred to sometimes as intermediate periods, which are times in which the monarchy was weaker. Sometimes there was fighting among different claimants. The economy begins to go downhill. And in terms of military terms as well, ancient Egypt runs into difficulties. And that's at least one easy way to break up this period, this huge country, into things that make sense, at least to us. Really, again, in all of these periods, very clear to us is that this is a monarchical state above all else. And it's a state that really was held together in some sense by military victory. And that is the reason why the vast majority of our sources issue forth from the king, and very often are meant to praise him. And scenes like this, for instance, I just give you one of many examples that show the king in action, and going to battle, because that's in fact what the king anticipated that he had to do to be able to keep invaders away, to conquer the land, to bring money in. So all these things were anticipated that a king would do. So it wasn't just a matter of forging Egypt in the beginning. It had constantly the need for power and war. The other thing, of course, that we have, and this is just one of many I could have shown you, is the king had to continually outlay money that he got through wars on agriculture, and use and really build up these larger-than-life monuments, some of which simply glorify the king, others of which were intended for religious purposes, and in fact, many cases, the two were inseparable. At the same time in which you were honoring the king, you were also honoring the gods. As I'll discuss for a moment, the line between king and god was not very clear to ancient Egyptians. All right, let me take a step back though and talk a little bit more seriously about the king. The term all of you will know when we're discussing ancient Egypt, this ruler is Pharaoh. And the reason we use this term in the modern world to describe the ancient Egyptian king is very simple. It is used in the Bible. As ancient Egypt used to be studied, generally you had people who were very well versed in the Bible, and then they turned to study ancient Egypt after the fact. So they already had the term Pharaoh rattling around in their brains, and so they used it. In ancient Egypt itself, it wasn't until the New Kingdom, so relatively late in Egypt's history, that anyone used the term Pharaoh to refer just to one person at the center of the government. Pharaoh used to refer to the entire court of the king, his buildings, the people who served him, and the king. It was a very gradual process in ancient Egypt by which that term gets monopolized by one person. And again, I'm just showing you some of these are some kind of burial mass with the burials of burials or tombs. Again, which one of the things, of course, we always associate with these is gold, which once again is prized in ancient Egypt as it is today. In fact, one of the main trade items that ancient Egyptians had at their disposal was gold. In fact, it's known as the lamp shining with gold. Many of our earliest our documents having to do with the king make it very clear that his power is connected to the natural world. He had sort of supernatural powers that go beyond what you might think a king is capable of. That in fact, There are documents that imply that the pharaoh has the ability to make the Nile River rise and then make it fall, which is to say, in effect, he had the power to make this whole entire civilization live or die by his own will. We think that there's really no doubt, in effect, that when Egypt is strong, the king is in charge of the entire land. As I mentioned to you earlier, in some of our earliest documents, it's very clear to us that the king always depicts himself as being a descendant of the gods. But as time goes on, and we get more and more sources, there's no longer any line at all between being a descendant of the gods and just being a god. And in fact, in time, the pharaoh simply referred to as gods in the flesh, gods that are walking around among us. And in fact, it was really incumbent upon ancient Egyptians to venerate the pharaoh in life as a god. This, of course, is, to give you some idea of the implications of this position, it was not until around the Middle Kingdom in which anyone believed that people other than the pharaoh had an afterlife. The belief up until that point had been everyone else lives and then they die, and that's it. The only person whose soul lives on was the pharaoh, although that changes as time goes on. But everyone always believed the pharaoh, he was definitely living with the gods after his death. Please.
Does that mean that all the people who weren't a pharaoh just were just thrown outside the kingdom? Did they have a burial?
Yeah, they did bury them. The vast majority of people in ancient Egypt, the way they bury them is very simple. You get your shovel, you go to the sands, and you stick them underneath. That was it.
So after the Middle Kingdom, and everyone kind of thought that everyone had an afterlife, did they take more care in the burial process?
Sometimes they would bury people in sand and give them a little bit of pot, a pot with some food or something like that.
Oh, wow.
When we think about ancient Egypt, I'll talk a little bit more about burials in a moment, but you always think about the people at the top of the social ladder. And they could actually inform the treatment of their body and a beautiful sort of a place to put their body. The vast majority of people in ancient Egypt had nothing. And so the sand naturally served as a burial spot for most people. They even say sometimes in ancient Egypt, the sand's blown a certain way. Oh, look, it's a dead person. And in fact, the temperature will preserve them much better than in other places. So part of the reason why, again, I talk so much about the pharaoh is because he's all over the damn place. Here is one pharaoh you can see. Again, a man of war. They love this motif. Notice here he has, again, a club. He's about to bash the skull of several different captives after battle. He's simultaneously getting blessed by the god of the sun. And this, of course, as many monuments are in ancient Egypt, is an enormous scale. This is much bigger than a normal human being. I show you here another, again, this is a temple dedicated, you don't have to know his name, this is to the pharaoh Ramses II. And you'll see he's decided to put up a picture of himself, a statue of himself. A normal human being would come to approximately here. And these are 4 statues of Ramses II, Ramses II, Ramses II. And if it hadn't fallen down in an earthquake, also Ramses II. There was no value in humility. I mean, they were larger than life and they wanted to portray themselves as such. Yeah.
How did they build these? Because they don't have the technology that we have today.
I'll talk a little bit more with the pyramids, but in essence, they had very primitive techniques of technology, but they were very good at using them, very good at, in effect, just measurement, sculpting very precisely. So they didn't need the technology to be able to build these things. They just essentially being extremely careful with what they had. If people come to this class, normally the only pharaoh that they've ever heard of is King Tut, Tutankhamun. You don't really need to know his name for the purpose of this class if you don't know it already, because in terms of ancient Egyptian pharaohs, King Tut was an absolute bust. He had a very short reign. He died young, probably of injuries and disease. So the reason why people today talk about King Tut is in essence because we have his stuff. We actually managed to find his burial chamber that was intact, well, almost completely intact from the ancient world in the 20th century. And that's the reason why we talk so much about King Tut. Not because he was a great pharaoh, but because we have his stuff, which probably would have been so much less than most of the great pharaohs whose stuff was stolen a long time ago. So the question, of course, students always asked in the past was, okay, fine, who is the great pharaoh? This is someone you've never heard of, potentially. This is a pharaoh known as Thutmose III. Thutmose III was successful in exactly the way opposed that ancient Egyptians wanted their pharaohs to be, which was in war. Thutmose III was more than anything else. He was someone who every single year he went out on campaign. He went to the Middle East, and he basically started beating up on cities until they recognized him as their lord. And then every year they would send him a shipment of various goods. If they stopped sending a shipment, he'd go back the next season and then beat up a bunch more people, and then they would send him money. And so that was one of the reasons why ancient Egyptians loved him. He produced a lot of booty through war and conquered a lot of cities. And for that reason, just as any successful pharaoh, we have so many monuments from Thutmose III. My personal favorite, this is his obelisk. You all know obelisks, right? Because we love them in the United States too. And in fact, this obelisk is in the United States. This is an obelisk of Thutmose III that is currently in Central Park in New York. The reason, in the 19th century, Americans began to feel obelisk envy because all of the great European cities were getting them. So we managed to take one from Egypt, and we re-erected it, in essence. Yeah, please.
We're not preserving it in any way, it's just open to the ravages of
Yeah,
nature?
there is a coating on this one in particular. Yeah, it's just out in the open. To be fair, when they discovered it, it was lying on the ground, and it was also not particularly well preserved, but it was not necessarily used at the times of Manhattan. Please.
So then did we base our Washington Monument?
Yeah, on obelisks generally. And it wasn't just us. In the ancient world too, like Romans, for instance, loved obelisks. And so in essence, but the Egyptians are the ones who started this form. If you could read this inscription, it would in fact be very boring indeed in some ways, in that it's just yet another inscription talking about the many cities that Thutmose III has completely destroyed, and how the gods have blessed his reign, which again, all of them felt, and of course these guys felt. Now, although ancient Egyptians held out the sort of myth that the pharaoh could do anything, everyone knew that every pharaoh needed to have a very large bureaucracy that surrounded him to be able to get any work done at all. At the height of this pyramid is a figure known as the Vizier. The Vizier, in essence, was kind of like a right-hand man to the pharaoh. Could do anything that the pharaoh asked, and in particular was entrusted with sensitive missions or important missions. One of them, to give you an example, was, as we'll talk in a moment, the building of pyramids was really born of Vizier's work. There were also people who we refer to as provincial governors. The pharaoh could not be all places at all times, and so he would send out governors to help him to basically be his eyes and ears on the ground in various parts of his kingdom. Here's one with his family. Viziers and governors were generally of the absolute top of the nobility. Even if, though, you were not at the absolute peak of society, there was one opportunity for you to enter government. And that is a position known as a scribe, which is exactly as it sounds. Scribes wrote. And they would write all kinds of government documents, letters, records. All of these things were done by scribes. It was a good job if you got it. It was a civil service job, but it took years of training, because just to learn the ancient Egyptian form of writing is an extremely difficult task in and of itself. Also for ancient Egyptians, it wasn't necessarily you wouldn't know how to write the system just because you spoke the language. If you got the job of scribe, though, it was a fantastic job. It was known as a white kilt job, as you can see. They have these basically things that look like kilts that they wore. And unlike all the other people who had to do jobs that got them all dirty, and they smelled stinky at the end of the day, the scribes were proud of the fact that they would never have to get their kilt dirty, white full times. So it was a source of pride for them. They weren't like the rest of people. The vast majority of people in ancient Egypt were peasants, and who worked the land, did this kind of agriculture. So if you had a connection to the Nile, we talked about. This is one of, again, just one, give you one idea of some of the work that the ancient Egyptian peasants were required to do. This was painted on someone's burial chamber, in essence, because not because they liked looking at peasants, but because they felt that if they said certain spells, they could force the peasants to come back to life and do work for the rich in debt as well. You also notice again, if you're an ancient Egyptian child, there's no point in wearing clothes. It's really hot in ancient Egypt. By the way, don't worry about anyone in civilization having gotten like cancer or anything from sun cancer, because they all died so young that it really never really came into question. So it was lucky that. The other thing you had to do as a peasant, in addition to simply working in the field, was working on monuments. And this was not labor that you gave out of love for Pharaoh. You were forced to work. Whenever Pharaoh wanted something built, that's the workforce, when they weren't doing agriculture.
Were they basically slaves?
The only difference between them and slaves is that they had personal freedom. They could be forced to do certain things, but you couldn't buy and sell them. Yeah, so they weren't owned by anybody, but it is fair to say that their lives are very limited in the kind of choices that they could actually make.
Could they freely leave Egypt if they wanted?
And it would have been extremely difficult for them to do so. In most cases, if you were born a peasant, you died a peasant.
Oh,
So.
that's great.
There's at least some, you notice that it's no accident that we've been talking a lot about men. Most of our sources of ancient Egypt tend to involve men in one form or another. This is not to say that women had no role, certainly the opposite. We do know, in fact, there are some examples of extremely powerful women, sometimes behind the throne, and sometimes actually on the throne. There are two examples, in fact, of female pharaohs, so women who actually become pharaohs in ancient Egypt. We also do have all sorts of love poetry and sometimes these little dioramas that show us something of the more sort of personal side of human interactions in an ancient Egyptian home, which at least seem to imply that you shouldn't necessarily think that men are in charge of everything. In fact, there is a certain level of equality, not complete equality, but it is fair to say too that in terms of the divine world, we'll talk more about this in a moment. There were lots of goddesses that ancient Egyptians prayed to. Just one quick example is the goddess Isis, shown here. It has nothing to do with the modern group Isis. This was a female goddess who, in particular, was prayed to by women for women's issues, fertility, motherhood. Also, a goddess thought to be very powerful for praying to for magic. We also know that occasionally women could actually become scribes. There's a female word for scribes. So occasionally, probably not often. The form of conspicuous consumption that you know the best from ancient Egypt are these great monuments, and among them, of course, are the pyramids, which of course stand out still in the modern imagination as being some of the great things that they produce. It is fair to say, first of all, if you're under the impression that all ancient Egyptian houses kind of look like pyramids, just at a smaller scale, you are wrong. In effect, the majority of houses in ancient Egypt were built with mud brick, and now they're completely gone. They're really probably ramshackle affairs for the most part. There's certainly nothing like the kind of structures that they were using to build pyramids in the ancient world. This is a one called a red pyramid. And these are some of the pyramids that you probably know a little better. These are pyramids from Giza, which is a plain that's not too far to the south of the Delta region. And chosen because it was an area that, first of all, it's relatively flat. And secondly, this was an area that's close enough to water that they could actually cart in some of these great bricks to be able to use to build up the pyramids. In previous times, you probably have heard some of the theories that people had to bring in aliens to help human beings build pyramids. First of all, you know probably already that I'm going to say that's wrong. And it is. And really, in some ways, as we mentioned earlier, the technology used to build pyramids was not really some sort of remarkably advanced technology. They didn't have levers and pulleys, for instance, to be able to break up these bricks, just to show you the level of technology we're dealing with. What they did have was sleds. They would use these little sleds, and they would put stones on them, and then they would wet the sand in front of them, and people would just pull, pull, pull. When they got close to the area they were constructing the pyramid, they would put up dirt ramps, and again, people would just pull, and then when they had to put one of these bricks in place, you get a bunch of peasants, they would lift it up and put it in place, brick after brick. And that is how they did it. And once the entire thing was built, they took away the mud, they shined it, and that's it. You get your pyramid. We know that from the Old Kingdom, kings began to use pyramids as burial places. And for again, reasons that they wanted to show their wealth, and probably too, there's probably religious significance to the shape of the pyramids too. Some people think, and this is probably the correct theory, that they're just like shafts of the sun coming down. And of course, as we'll see, they worship the sun, that makes sense. Other people think that they're meant to imitate these sort of primordial mounds from the beginning of humanity that existed, which is also possible, but the sun theory makes the most sense to me. I should say that after the Old Kingdom is over, so relatively early in Egypt's history, they stopped using the pyramids because people begin to recognize that these things are like huge targets for thieves. And in fact, long before we got to the modern world, people completely took everything that was not nailed down in these pyramids, leaving very little behind. They were robbed blind. And in fact, later kings were sensitive to this fact. They said, I'm not going to put all my stuff to the afterlife in this thing to be robbed. And so they stopped building pyramids at that point. Again, even for the people of the ancient world, not just for ancient Egypt, the pyramids always sort of really caught people's imaginations. And in a way, of course, that an underground burial, which they switched to later on, they never really could. Just to give you some idea, by the way, I mentioned sleds. This is actually just one example from ancient Egypt. You see, this is a huge sled that they have this particular statue on. And as I said, they would put water in front of them to drag these things along. That's how they would do it. One of the things that always catches people about ancient Egypt is the strength of its religion. And again, one manifestation of this, as I mentioned, is that people tend to be mummified if you have money. Most people are not, and you're very, very carefully. Another sign of this is just the huge number of gods that ancient Egypt has at its disposal. Estimates put it around 2,000 gods that people worship at one time or another, but not always with equal fervor. Depending upon the period, some gods would be more worshipped or less worshipped. Some of the big ones, is Osiris, the god of the dead, shown in green because just like vegetation, he regenerates even after his death, comes back. But many of the gods too have these kind of animal heads. At least some people feel these were probably at some point animals that were worshipped that eventually grew legs, grew bodies and legs. And people who go together from worship kind of gods. Another god that, here's Osiris, by the way, is often seen as the judge of the dead in particular. Another god, just to give you another example, that's very important, is the god Amun-Re, who is the most important god of the sun. You can actually see a shaft of the sun coming into Amun-Re's headdress up here. Again, if you had to live in ancient Egypt, the sun beating down as it did, you'd understand why the sun becomes such a popular focus among the gods. There was no missing, and they used to hold long ceremonies to worship it, which we know because some foreign diplomats complained about having to attend them when they went to ancient Egypt. And we have mentioned that, of course, with pharaohs, one of the things that you constantly have to show yourself doing is really going out of your way to prove that even you as a god, you still have a close relationship to the other more established gods. So, for instance, here's just one pharaoh worshiping Amun-Re to show his piety, to show his veneration of God. There was once an attempt in ancient Egypt, a failed attempt, to try to consolidate all of these gods. Probably the world's first attempt at creating something like monotheism, at least in one god. One pharaoh in particular had people begin to destroy statues of other gods and wanting to worship a version of the sun god. The end of this, it was a complete and absolute failure. Egyptians were very religiously conservative. They liked their hundreds upon hundreds of gods. And so not only did this attempt fail, but this is one of the reasons why this king was hated afterwards at his destruction of monuments of having other gods. We're all accustomed to having not only priests, but priests who do things out publicly to show your veneration to God in particular. In ancient Egypt, with gods plural, we know that there were lots of rituals that had to be done to placate the gods, to make them happy. But, and here's a big but, we often have no idea what they were. Ancient Egyptian priests would lock themselves up in their temples, and they would do their rituals. Occasionally, they would have these kind of popular processions. They would take out images of gods and show people. But very often, no one from the public was allowed to come. The way you knew that these things were happening, Egypt continued to flourish. You continued to get money and success in war. That's how you knew the gods were happy with their rituals. Not because you saw them personally. All right. One of the most popular texts having to do with religion in ancient Egypt, and one you look actually at partially for homework, is a text known as the Book of the Dead. This is just one of many images from the book. When we found Book of the Dead, the reason we get its name, when we have these texts, they were buried with people who at the very least were upper middle class, and sometimes probably had a lot richer than that, who chose to have a Book of the Dead that was made for them specifically. Now you may think, I mentioned to you at one point Egyptians didn't think their soul lasted at all. And you may think that when this begins to change, everyone will be happy to get to have an afterlife. But in fact, it caused a great deal of anxiety in ancient Egypt, because how do you know how to operate in the afterlife? How do you know what to say to gods? How do you know even where to travel? You didn't. What you had to do then was create a guidebook for yourself. And that's exactly what they do. People would go to scribes, and they would ask them to create a book of the dead for them to tell them what they were supposed, spells you were supposed to say, where you were supposed to go, how to be successful in the afterlife, more or less. What's very interesting about these texts is that they were customizable. There was not one standard model. There's no printing presses. So you could go to a scribe and say, listen, give me all of these great images. I want like a deluxe copy. Or you could say, if you didn't have as much money, give me the bare bones. I want the absolute spells I'm going to need, but nothing else. And in some cases, we have copies of the Book of the Dead that are really very low budget affairs. In all of the scenes, all of the Book of the Dead, if there's one scene that is depicted at all, this by far is the most famous scene. This is the scene in which your heart, that is a heart, believe it or not, is weighed against a feather. And if you do not have any bad deeds, what we refer to as sins, that were still attributed to you, if you were completely free of them, then your heart would weigh less than a feather. And then you could successfully move on to the blessed afterlife. If you failed, this guy here, sometimes known as the Devourer, made up of parts of several different animals, would eat you. That's it. Annihilation was the end. There was no hell. And as you can see, in many cases, we have these spectacular images of all sorts of gods that you have to tell spells to if they were going to let you continue to move. Please.
So you said like they weigh the heart and feather, and like what did they know was good and bad? Like, do we know how they?
And in fact, I didn't go into this, but they have very long lists of things you have to say. I have not stolen. I have not committed adultery. And you'd have to go down long lists of. For us, would be a confession, more or less. Cleanse yourself of sins. So we do know what they thought was a sin. The other thing that I promised to talk to you about that is extremely important for all our source material in ancient Egypt is the very particular form of writing that they created, known today as hieroglyphs. No one in Egypt referred to these as hieroglyphs. This is a term first used by ancient Greeks. And the term itself means holy writing. And this is a term that's particularly annoying because hieroglyphs were used for all sorts of things. It wasn't just for religion. It was just that the ancient Greeks felt that, well, somehow this writing was holy or sacred and set apart from other things. But it wasn't in ancient Egypt. We still use the same term because it's been around so long. As many of you will know, yeah, please.
I was going to ask, what's the difference between hieroglyphs and petroglyphs?
And I'm sorry, what?
And petroglyphs?
Petroglyph is anything that is chiseled into stone.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. Hieroglyphs is more specifically this ancient Egyptian form, right?
Okay.
The reason, there's many reasons that hieroglyphs are difficult to read, one of which is, again, it just seemed initially to people who were not ancient Egyptian scribes, that's a bunch of funny squiggles and animals and things like that. The reason why it was even more difficult into the modern period to read hieroglyphs is that there is a mixture here of symbols, some of which stand for one consonant, just like in our alphabet, and some of them stand for entire words. They're mixed in together, and you just have to know the difference. Some of you will know, we don't talk much about this because of time, but one of the ways they use to finally decode this is this stone known as the Rosetta Stone, which has actually ancient Greek, has a script form of hieroglyphs and hieroglyphs, all on the same stone. And it allowed a French scholar in the 19th century to finally figure out hieroglyphs. But it was a long time to be able to do so. The other thing to note too is, again, not just one of the difficulties of interpreting ancient Egyptian culture is its language. The other is one of the source materials. And for that, I will get back to this stuff, which I talked about at the very beginning. This material known as papyrus, where more material is preserved than anywhere else. And here's an example of ancient papyrus. This is also papyrus, but in its unfinished form. And what papyrus is this plant that would grow on either side of the Nile and in the Delta. Ancient Egyptians would pluck it, slice it open, and then you would take out what's referred to as the pith, the kind of spongy part in the middle. And you would roll it out, like this. And you can actually use its natural glue to glue together pieces of papyrus, and you would allow it to dry. And this is the great paper of ancient Egypt. It would actually end up becoming the great paper too of ancient Rome as well. It used the same exact form of paper. So they didn't have paper, our form of paper. Papyrus, one of the reasons too it's very important for ancient Egypt is, especially in the deserts of ancient Egypt, it can actually last for centuries. If you have a particularly dry spot. And we in fact have discovered in many cases, even some of our greatest literary works from ancient Egypt were basically a piece of papyrus that was thrown out into the desert, and then someone digs it up later on. So especially before the dam I mentioned to you earlier in ancient Egypt, before that went up, ancient Egypt was even drier in essence. So there's more danger now that papyrus is destroyed over time. Yeah.
Why have we switched to trees? Like, why aren't we still using papyrus? Is it available?
It disintegrates a little bit too easily for anyone's taste, especially if you live in climates that are damper than ancient Egypt. It doesn't last as well.
So preserved if it's dry, if it stays dry.
Yeah, if it stays dry, it should be fine, absolutely. Once we had, of course, the knowledge of both hieroglyphs and papyrus, this is really what leads to the explosion of the kind of knowledge I've been talking about today. And even things we're not talking about today, for instance, like things like literature and everything, and we can really get into detail about ancient Egyptian culture for the first time. The last thought I'll leave you with is perhaps the most impressive thing I find about ancient Egyptian culture is its staying power. I mentioned to you again, this is a culture that lasted for millennia. And it is a culture, in fact, that in many cases, its artwork, its form of writing, even its form of living was so similar across centuries that it's sometimes difficult for historians to be able to distinguish one source from being from one period as opposed to being from another. Because it really did have this sort of sense of continuity among itself. Fortunately for ancient Egypt, as time went on, it began to lose a lot of its power, and it began to fall victim to a very powerful empire, we'll talk about later, from the Middle East, that will eventually come and conquer it and incorporate it as part of their own. So eventually it will lose its own independence. Final questions? All right, folks, we continue on Wednesday then. Thank you.
That's true, yeah. Well, I drove my